Hello, everybody. We're back. I was remiss when we closed down for our very short break in not thanking our panelists who persisted through our various technical glitches to keep going. Thank you, Violet. Thank you, Kojo. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Lucia. It's always really good to hear about what's happening in the rest of the world. And for those who are interested in what's happening in Nigeria and South Africa, Ojoma has put a message in the chat because she unfortunately lost connectivity. But if you look at her message in the chat, she is going to do a presentation we can see by email and send her any questions we might have on that. So thank you all so much. That was very informative. So Véronique Guévremont is now going to give us a presentation on discoverability of national content and trade liberalization issues. Véronique is a professor at the Faculty of Law at the Université Laval, and she holds the UNESCO Chair on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which is, of course, a co-organizer of this conference. So Véronique, I'll hand it over to you.
Merci, thank you, Kate. Et à titre de co-organisateur,
thank you very much. As a co-organizer, I would like to thank every panelist. Thank you for all your presentations. Thank you very much for joining us. So, first and foremost, I would like to explain why this presentation on discoverability is important. Today, we're talking about several reforms in the digital environment from all over the world. And as you may have heard, there are many reforms that are ongoing. And their goal wants to put forward national content on several platforms. And especially, it's difficult when these platforms are from abroad. When it comes to public policy to promote the content, to protect diversity of voices online, well, that's an objective that is seen as legitimate. And this fits with the Convention 2005 on the expression of cultural diversity. This is promoted by the directives of the conventions that have been adopted in 2017. But what does it mean in the commercial language? These measures can be seen as a form of discrimination. They can be seen as incompatible with the free trade accord. And the tension is not new. It has led many states, such as Canada, to exclude cultural commerce from the free trade agreements because states want to keep intervening in their cultural matters. However, for a number of years now, there has been an increasing amount of tensions because free trade agreements have now engagement in regards to digital economy, and now there is new cultural ways to be transmitted in the digital environment. This is a new environment. So the question is this one: how can states who want to keep their right to intervene in order to promote their own cultural expression in the digital environment can adapt this to a negotiation strategy when it comes to e-commerce? So I'm going to answer in three ways. First of all, I will mention that there is two trends in the evolution of commercial accords. First of all, engagements are being multiplied in free trade agreements. Let's agree, for a long time, there has been engagements when it comes to digital economy, but they're increasing. Let me give you an example. The Jordan-Canada agreement only has one article when it comes to e-commerce. But the ACU, it's like the renewed NAFTA, has 18 of them. On top of that, there is an annex. So the second trend, more recent, is all the chapter regarding e-commerce. When we're talking about the partnership of the DPA that we call in English, that leads the Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. This is a detailed accord. It has 16 modules with 80 articles on digital commerce, and it has many, many, many footnotes. So all of this has been multiplying as time moves forward. This brings me to my second point. Facing this trend, we have seen in different agreements, clauses, and different parties want to intervene in different ways in the digital world. And these clauses are necessary to allow states to do some reforms. These, because if they want to, for instance, have platforms that enhance their search engines or everything else. So let's take a look at the European Union approach now. In its most recent agreements, we have seen that they're adapting the strategy. There's an exclusion clause that used to be integrated to investment in services, but from now on, the same clause is added in the chapter for digital commerce. Same thing with the agreements with Japan, Mexico, UK, and this is all linking to e-commerce. Exclusion is written explicitly, and the goal is to protect the European Union, its member, and its sector. Another approach that we find in the DPA that I mentioned earlier, this is all the chapter on digital commerce. We're talking about here about culture and creativity, and all parties can adopt new rules, and they can get support to different artistic projects. In the beginning of the accord, we find the importance to promote cultural diversity and to rule for the public interest. We are here in an accord exclusively detailed in a numeric sphere, digital sphere, I should say. Secondly, the treatment of non-discriminatory is not applied to radio. It is very important for the discoverability of online content. And this is what we're going to talk about today. Third, the DPA contains a general exception. Parties can adopt support for their art. This way, they, unless they bring to some kind of discrimination. We also have definition of creative arts that take into their aspect literature, theater, films, video, creative content online, expression, cultural, indigenous issues, etc. And they're using new technology. And there's also creative art takes everything that has to do with the interpretation of arts and the development technical aspects. We are now here in presence of a wide definition. And we're also talking about here about digital technologies. Of course, we could bring it forward. We could think more about it. We could talk about cultural sovereignty inside of a country. Should we enhance protections? We don't have that much time today to talk about this. Maybe perhaps we should organize another panel on this. But what I want to underline today is that there are now cultural clauses that are being negotiated specifically adapting and talking about digital issues. They are all part in accords that are directly talking about e-commerce in order to promote the diversity of expressions online. There are several measures. There's quota, there's constrained financing for creation. Finally, I'm at my third and last point. I'm going to talk about Canada's approach. We know in the new NAFTA, Canada wants to keep its leverage. And there's also an important chapter on digital commerce in that accord. We have to mention that Canada has not modified its preamble for digital commerce. And some people were head scratching. There is, we can wonder if it should have not been updated in order to adapt to cultural products. Perhaps in the next few years, we're going to see some modifications, but we can hope that the cultural exemption should evolve over time. And this will allow the clause to be adapted, to be supported over time. But there's another question that is being asked. Which clause Canada will use when it will enter an accord that is exclusively talking about digital accord? Canada has been using the exception to the cultural clause. It dates from 1988. It is the date which Canada ratified its first free trade agreement with the United States. But the language that is found now is has not been updated because it has been there for a very long time and the words have not been updated. So we have recommended that Canada updates its cultural plan by incorporating an exclusive clause. But since now this has been, Canada doesn't have many legway to make some modification because, as you know, the accord has been ratified, and maybe later we'll be able to talk about it. But we may we may be able to make some modification in the future with several parties. But the question remains: what will happen the day where we'll be engaging a negotiation of a new accord completely dedicated to digital commerce? So we want to maintain Canada's digital sovereignty so we can control our cultural production online. Of course, we want to use modern aspect and modern vocabulary in the new accords. And I think that we have to think about it very strongly and we should hurry. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me. I don't think we have questions for this specific presentation because it took a bit long, but I will be very happy to answer your questions in the chat box. Thank you very much for panel number 4. Thank you very much, Veronique.
Do put them in the chat, but we'll move on to roundtable number 4 now, continuing our globe trotting with trends in the Asia Pacific region now, specifically South Korea and Australia. Sorry, I'm back there. My apologies. I seem to be having connectivity problems too. So I'm just going to, again, briefly introduce the panelists. If you want the longer bios, they're in the program. Ramon Lobato is Associate Professor in the School of Media and Communication, RMIT University in Australia. Matt Diener is the CEO of Screen Producers Australia. Michelle Zang is a lecturer in international trade law at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And Jeon is with the Korean Film Council. So those are our 4 panelists. And Ramon, if you want to start, I believe you're going to tell us about the Media Green Paper in Australia and bring us up to speed on that.
Yes, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yep, okay, fabulous. Well, thank you, Kate, and thanks to all the presenters. It's been a terrifically interesting last hour or so that I've been able to catch due to the time zones, but yeah, very pleased to be here. So yeah, as Kate mentioned, I work at RMIT, which is a university in Melbourne, and I'm part of a team of researchers here in Australia that look at local content and streaming policy. So yes, so it's a very kind of relevant event for us and very close to our interests. I'll just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So as Kate said, what I'm going to be speaking about today is the Australian government's media reform green paper, which came out in 2020 and which is the current regulatory proposal in Australia about streaming services and local content. So when I say local content, I mean kind of national content, so Australian content. So the green paper covers quite a few different issues, but I think the most relevant part of it for today is the proposal for the introduction of an original production obligation for major streaming services, which would require them to invest an as yet undecided figure, but the mooted kind of figure is 5% of their Australian revenues back into original local content production. So this is a proposal, it's not actual legislation. The policy process is pretty much on hold at the moment. It's been very slow and convoluted for various reasons. But what I'll present today does, I guess, gives a sense of government thinking on the issue and possible kind of outcomes. All right, so I might just start with, I have a slide here, which gives a sense of what the kind of problem from a government perspective is here. So what problem was this policy trying to address? So Australia has a long-standing local content policy for film and TV, which includes various production incentives and other measures, as well as a local content quota for broadcasters, which were obliged to show 55% local content between the hours of 6 AM and midnight. But obviously none of this touches streaming and SVOD in particular. So the writing's been on the wall for a long time that with the inevitable migration of audiences to subscription streaming, something would eventually need to be done about SVOD, and especially about Netflix, which is the most popular subscription service here in Australia by a very long way, and which has really dominated the policy kind of conversation here. So just for your interest, according to Ampere analysis, Australia is the most Netflix penetrated national market on a per capita basis anywhere in the world. So anyway, so yeah, Netflix is very large here in the discussions. Okay, so this said, government appetite for local content reform has been pretty weak, despite a series of reviews and reports that have looked at different aspects of the issue over the last many years, but have not quite kind of led anywhere. I might just mention here the Digital Platforms Inquiry, which had a lot of interesting and very kind of constructive things to say on social media, on news, on advertising, and on kind of harmonization of regulation. But that's, yeah, if you're interested in that, we could talk about that in Q&A. But anyway, so the end result right now is that SVOD is essentially unregulated for local content. And as a result, availability and discoverability of local content on SVODs is uneven, but generally very low. So we've been doing kind of catalog studies for the last 5 years of Netflix and some of the other services here. And for Netflix, it's generally 1 to 3% of the catalog is local content. And there's an obvious regulatory disparity between what applies to streaming and what applies for broadcast. So that has been kind of front of mind in the policy process. Okay, so the next slide I'll just go on now to speak about what the Green Paper is proposing. Okay, so the main proposal, as I mentioned, is a production obligation suggested at 5% of Australian revenues for the major streaming services, which they would have to plough back into Australian production in order to guarantee a minimum level of investment in new Australian content. So again, that 5% is a controversial figure, and I'm sure Matt will speak to this in a moment, but industry and cultural sector groups have been arguing for 20%. So which services would this apply to? So the eligible services are the kind of large professional content AVODs and SVODs. So Netflix, but not YouTube. Stan, which is the local SVOD service, but not niche services, not small niche services. Excuse me, sorry, it would not apply to Stan because that is owned by a local broadcaster, the Nine Network, which are controversially kind of excluded from these measures. But just as interesting, I think, for the discussion today is what is not in the Green Paper, what is out of scope. So in Australia, there has been a lot of discussion about potential quotas, catalogue quotas, but that is effectively off the table now. That has not been part of the Green Paper proposals. And on discoverability, so there were only 2 sentences about discoverability in this document. So it's hard to see that discoverability will form part of the final package of measures, but we will wait and see. I'll speak about this just at the end, but discoverability debate here in Australia is kind of a bit more nascent than in Canada and the EU. So yeah, very interesting to hear your perspectives on this today. And there's a lot of definitional issues to be worked out. Australian content, new content, which genres it would apply to, whether sport should be included, all these kinds of things are still to be thrashed out, but would potentially make quite a bit of difference in terms of what services it applies to and how they would be affected. Okay, so I'll end, that's the final slide, but I'll just end with a couple of quick observations. So yeah, so that's what's on the table now after years of discussion. It's fairly modest by international standards, or at least in some of the countries that we've heard from today. It covers production, but it doesn't get to the kind of audience and cultural policy sides of this issue in a substantive way. So it's really, perhaps it's more kind of industry policy in some ways than cultural policy. Unlike with the AVMSD, there's a disarticulation in these proposals between production measures and catalogue measures and discoverability measures. So they're not being addressed in an integrated way, which is, for some observers, kind of problematic. And finally, so what about kind of cultural diversity, and what about this kind of thinking? This is the topic that brings us here today, and where is it in these proposals? Well, I think, while that remains an important kind of stated principle of media policy in Australia, I'd have to say, from my kind of observations of the debate here, like in practice, the policy kind of agenda in Australia has been driven by other things at the moment. So that is, in particular, addressing the regulatory imbalance between OTT and broadcast, the introduction of protectionist measures to support local services against offshore OTT services, a pragmatic desire within government to keep broadcasters on side, especially in the lead up to an election. So a lot of this policy is really being driven by the needs of broadcasters, and who have been given a lot of kind of regulatory liberalisation over the last few years. And the final thing that I think is part of this conversation is a generalised kind of techlash sentiment, which informs policymaking both on social media but also on entertainment services. And the boundaries between them are kind of blurring in the policy conversation quite a bit. And this also aligns pretty strongly, the kind of anti-platform arguments, with arguments of local media incumbents who remain very powerful here in Australia, including News Corporation. So that's the kind of realpolitik, I think, of the policy debate in Australia right now. And it's perhaps why some of the more complex issues around discoverability and prominence and so forth have not been such a feature of this debate. But it is fabulous to be here today to kind of hear and learn from developments in other countries. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Ramon. That really was great, brought us up to speed on the green paper. And now Matt Diener from Screen Producers Australia, if you want to continue with the conversation from Australia.
Sure. Welcome everyone, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I am. I'm in the beautiful area of Sydney, and I think one of the things we always like to do when we start a conversation in Australia is to acknowledge the 65,000 years of storytelling that Australians enjoy, courtesy of the Indigenous communities in which we all, I guess, participate with increasingly in Australia, which is a wonderful thing. I think Ramon did a great job of summarising some of the issues, and I thought rather than kind of start from scratch, I thought maybe I'll pick some of the pieces up to help illustrate perhaps some of the issues from the industry's point of view. I look after the screen production businesses in our industry as a collective, and we have a number of people that make film and television and games content. Some of the membership are internationally owned large companies, but the majority of businesses here are domestic owned and operating as probably micro businesses in terms of size. So it's a very small business community. And oversecting some of the conversations around media, big picture plays about this issue. Big picture plays about the role of small business in our industry and community and economy versus large business and their interests. It's also about the influence and power of media proprietors, as Ramon suggested, and that has driven a narrative. It's also a story of the last 10 years in which we have had a conservative government in place, which has, as a sort of a policy starting point, looks to minor interventions in marketplaces. It has an ideology more about letting free market enterprise operate, and has gone down a path in our industry as a priority exercise of looking to create incentives in our market rather than regulatory frameworks. So we've got all of that as ideology and context operating here. There's also, and I agree completely with Ramon's position and thoughts around media concentration here. We have, in order to, I guess, service the needs of powerful media enterprises, there have been in the past controls around the degree to which markets are owned and controlled by multiple mediums. In an internet age, that is increasingly less significant. As a consequence, some of the rules collapse, which has also compounded the issues associated with where we go for regulation in the future, because in the cases of two of the broadcasters' traditional forms of delivery, using spectrum, in which there was always a compact made between those businesses and a servicing of Australian cultural interests through types of work such as children's content and Australian drama, there was a kind of exchange there that they had a protected market almost, and as a consequence, they were there to deliver not only an overall amount of Australian content into the market, which could include repeats and low value content, but also a type of genre of content which was considered more culturally significant, such as documentaries and Australian dramas and Australian children's content. And that compact has sort of broken a bit over the last year or two as a government has sought to both reduce the regulatory obligation on those businesses by removing some of the obligations to release. In fact, they have removed all of the obligations on those businesses to release content for children in the market, and they have the government has removed or pretty much halved the output that it's required to, that those businesses, traditional businesses, are required to release into the market for Australian narrative drama. And look, part of that is an understanding of free-to-air, over-the-top businesses struggling in a more of a subscription age, and that audiences are increasingly not wanting to look at content that has ads in it. If they're looking for drama, they go to the paid services, and also that children's content is often found in other services as well, rather than free services. So there is a logic to some of the government's moves, but the struggle has been that in removing part of the obligation on some of those businesses, there hasn't been an equivalent increase, as we're talking about now, onto the new businesses. So there's no, at the moment, we've seen a drop of regulation and no framework yet put in place. And so what we are talking about is we're sort of chewing over the debate around this still, but no action has been placed. The complication has become that when we first started this conversation 10 years ago as an industry collective, there was a different government, a more liberal government in place that was minded, I think, to move faster than this government has in restoring or figuring out this framework. And those businesses were separate. There wasn't ownership between streaming services and traditional broadcasters. Now in Australia, there is, at least in 2 of the 3 major broadcasting businesses, there is ownership of streaming services alongside their own traditional models, which has complicated the policy debate. So where we're ending up worryingly is potentially a situation where instead of transferring regulation across to different, growing areas, there's a potential deregulation of everywhere in order to get to a level playing field, which would be a significant problem to the industry. And I think where we're at the moment is that the government is trying to, I think, test whether or not, if by deregulating and not having regulation in place, the industry is able to survive on its own. We have the results of what it's looked like after a year, which I might talk to in a minute, but I think that's kind of where we've been as a sort of a holding pattern. Where we struggle in Australia is a couple of things. We've had a very shifting changes of and new prime ministers, which if anyone's followed our national conversations, there's been new prime ministers quite regularly in Australia, and that's changed policy structures because you can't get a continual set of thinking around what we're going to do if the uncertainty of prime ministers and governments keep shifting. We also have a 3-year term, which means that there's a short period for each federal parliament to sit, which sort of keeps the cycle of needing to keep competing in the modern age for attention from voters. And this area, Australians start with really loving Australian content. There is a passion for this content. I think the challenge is whether or not it becomes a vote issue in the market for politicians. And look, we've found that, in fact, some of the most conservative politicians are more responsive to our arguments for greater interventions, perhaps because of the sense of pride of place and certainty about where we are. I know I haven't got a huge amount of time, but I wanted to just add a couple of extra things into the mix. One of them is that there is to be, we understand, in the first quarter of this year, the release of a white paper. We've had a green paper. We're understanding the next stage will be a white paper, which is a bold move because we have an election in May. That the minister has signalled to us that he will release a white paper, which will be not a further embedding of what it is that the government will be doing in this space. The reason why it's bold is that it will make some groups in the industry unhappy. If we're happy, then maybe traditional media or streaming services will be unhappy. If we're unhappy, then so be it. We'll be, very vigorous in our disdain for government if it isn't the case that we get sort of closer to the measures we've been wanting to seek. The other parts of this are that part of the problem or reasons we, as a sector, haven't been particularly vocal about discoverability or the library intervention more. We've been focused on making sure that there's investment in the market overall and stimulation of new work. Part of the challenge for Australia is that we have a population of 26 million. And so in Europe, the measures to do with a library quota kind of deal with a very interchangeability of lots of different countries' works to make up the 30% that is there as a requirement on the streamers. In Australia, there isn't a huge amount of, relatively speaking, for the size of the library, there's not a huge amount of output. So it seems at times a challenge to create a measure, but there's some thinking about maybe making even a smaller measure than, say, the European measure, so that there's some requirement overall to have Australian content as a baseline within the service. The issue would be just that the service would have to, if it's too high a percentage of local content, the service would be reduced in terms of quantity of total titles, if that makes sense. But there's also, there's two other things that are going on at the moment. One of them is that commercial free-to-air services or traditional broadcasters are starting a campaign around the need for their apps effectively to be discoverable easily on home screens of internet television. So they were looking for discoverability of their overall services. That helps to open up the conversation in Australia about the need for discoverability of Australian content on those services as well. We're just coming in under the coattails, I think, of that conversation. And the second thing that I guess I wanted to leave you with is that we are very mindful, and it wasn't covered in the papers that have been brought up for the discussion in Australia, but we're very mindful of the intellectual property argument and the need for a retention and management and control of our storylines in Australia by Australians, or at least a fair exchange for the use of those storylines. And that goes through to including a measure we have in our proposals to government, that there be a percentage of the expenditure that is being asked of these streamers, not only just for children's content, but for drama, but also for Indigenous Australian content. So that we can't at this point, stomach an idea that the streamers are able to spend the money on Australian content and then maybe take all of our intellectual property offshore forever and have it held out of country. That's a very big problem for us. And the other debate that is tense at the moment is that the streamers want to redefine Australian content so that it is essentially American feeling content, no offense to my American colleagues, but American content that happens to have a few more Australians in creative roles perhaps. And so that's another debate to watch, that a redefining of what Australian content is, because that would suit the streamers to essentially be making offshore productions that look and feel like American content, but just with a few more extra people. And I think I worry at times that our government is slightly susceptible to this. So that's something else we're watching. I think I'll end it there given the timing.
Yes,
but
thank you
appreciate
so
the time.
much, Matt. That was great. Thank you for bringing us up to speed. As always, there are familiar issues being dealt with in Australia for a Canadian audience, and maybe we can pick up on some of what you were mentioning at the end in the question period. I'll turn now to Michelle, who will tell us about the situation in New Zealand. Michelle, if you want to unmute and go ahead.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for the event organizers to send me the invite to such a fantastic series. And I cannot even claim that I understand fully. Unfortunately, I did not follow very up with Veronique's presentation, given my limited knowledge in French, but I'm sure I will be following up with her for every single detail she has presented. So if you give me a second, allow me to share the screen with you. So basically, I'm working as a lawyer at Wellington. So my academic background is basically European law and international trade law. Just from a couple of years ago, I started my research on Indigenous interests based on the New Zealand experience. So today, in the following 8 minutes, I will try to table the situation about Indigenous culture presentation in New Zealand, the status quo of it, and the reason for why it is so. So in New Zealand, the system at the moment for broadcasting is what I defined as a dual track broadcasting system. Within that system, which simply includes all the mechanism, fundings, and entities that have been established for mainstream New Zealand culture, they ought to have a counterpart in promotion and preservation for Maori culture and language. So the purpose of such dual track broadcasting system is pretty clear. They want to guarantee the culture visibility or discoverability and accessibility for both Maori culture and mainstream New Zealand culture are developing in parallel and hand in hand. Here I have a couple of examples. For example, for government fundings, we have the Maori Broadcasting Funding Agency and the New Zealand On Air, which is the New Zealand National Broadcasting Commissions. So both entities are crown entities. Here means a government entities that they give out fundings, responsible for funding for public broadcasting, particularly for local content. With regard to the broadcasting platforms, we have dedicated Maori Television, a national network of more than 20 Maori radio stations on the one hand. On the other hand, is the New Zealand national free-to-air TV channels and a New Zealand or English-speaking network of radio stations. I would like to shed light on slightly for a couple of mechanisms I just mentioned. The first one is the Maori Television, which is launched and funded by New Zealand government and launched in 2004. And Maori Television is the most screened pre-time local content televisions in New Zealand. Also, the funding agency of Maori production, the Maori Broadcasting Funding Agency, was founded in 1994, which is an outcome of the amendment of the Broadcasting Act in New Zealand in 1993. So the agency is dedicated to sustainable regeneration and promotion of Maori culture and language. So all the fundings come from agencies, covers mixed platforms together with music. Mixed platform here, including digital platform, traditional TV, linear TV station, as well as radios. So here, with this very brief introduction, the main message I would like to pass on is compare with many jurisdictions and states in the world, New Zealand has established a relevant advanced system insofar as Indigenous interest and Indigenous culture is concerned. Of course, it is not an overnight project. It's actually dated back to the social campaign for preservation and protection of Maori culture dated back to 1960s and 70s. So what I want to introduce here is some very fundamental but basic explanation for the status quo here. So in a nutshell, the Indigenous representation as well as Indigenous culture in New Zealand, it is not only, as other countries, a matter of social inclusiveness or social justice. This is a constitutional matter. It's a matter of constitutional significance. So it boils down eventually the founding document of New Zealand. New Zealand, as all the other of many countries in the world, they have an unwritten constitution, but they do have a founding document for the country, which is the Treaty of Waitangi. Waitangi Treaty was signed in 1840 between the British Crown and Maori chiefs. So it is recognized as a founding document of New Zealand, and also the Treaty of Waitangi Day is the national day of the nation as well. As a treaty, it has a very brief content, only 3 articles. So the first article recognizes the British Crown's right to govern in New Zealand. The second article recognizes Maori's power, or Maori retains the full ownership over their land and resources. And the third article, Maori people has the full rights and protection as a British subject. So regardless of the very controversial issue of how we should interpret the 3 brief articles, one widely and commonly accepted interpretation of Article 2 is that Maori culture and language is part of the treasure that the Crown or the government has to be actively supporting, need to be actively supported and promoted. For example, Maori language is recognized as the New Zealand national language, and Maori language can be used in the courtroom in New Zealand, and as well as the culture against preaching as important, significant status as the mainstream New Zealand culture. So that is the basic explanation for what has been built up nowadays in New Zealand. So just a couple words about digital reform. Of course, when we're looking at counterpart OECD countries in the North Hemisphere, or as well as our neighbor country, Australia. And I have to call, as a lawyer, I would like to send a comment that the digital reform process in New Zealand is slightly falling behind. So the media and online content regulation is currently going through a comprehensive review since June last year, 2021. At this stage, the outcome of this legislative review is unknown and uncertain. But what is already published as a primary focus of the digital platform reform is on the harmful and illegal content. This is the only focus so far the government has announced. So unfortunately, local content, either from New Zealand mainstream culture or from indigenous culture of Maori language or Maori production, are not specifically mentioned during the review process. So for my short presentation today, the main message I would like to pass on is to make a distinction to highlight the distinctiveness of the indigenous interest, indigenous culture status in New Zealand as compared to the rest of the world. Here I have my email here, and really looking forward to any questions or discussions after the presentation. So I would just stop here and return the floor to you, Kate.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. That was very interesting. Unfortunately, Anna Maria White, who was our other New Zealand speaker from Maori Arts, wasn't able to join us today. So we're really grateful to have your perspective on what's going on in New Zealand. And now we'll turn to South Korea and Jeon, who's joining us from the Korean Film Council. Yoon, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Kate. Do you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. It's very early morning here at 5:30 from Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss such a timely and interesting topic on cultural contents in the digital environment. My name I am Yoonhyung. I'm a UNESCO's Expo Facility member for 2005 convention, and I have been working at Korean Film Council since 2004, covering a wide sector of projects, including production and distribution funds, and policy research and implementation. And apart from Korean Film Council, I'm also teaching at Kyunghee University for the past couple of years. So today I'm going to, in a very casual manner, I'm going to provide overview of the current existing protection measures in South Korea on TV, mainly on TV broadcasting and films, and sharing the ongoing debates and promoting the local contents in digital environments. So let me allow to have a few seconds to share the presentation. So it's basically it's mostly sorry. Oops. Yeah. So it's just an images. So, well, there are measures which puts in place to protect and promote local contents in domestic markets in South Korea. Well, first, there is a quota on TV and broadcasting sector by Broadcasting Act, a presidential decree. The enforcing every TV channel should broadcast at least 60% local content, meaning the South Korean contents. It varies into the local broadcaster and cable channel, but what I'm saying here, the 60% is a major the TV stations and broadcasters. And second, there is also a quota to protect local cinema. The screen quota is one of the most recognized modality when it comes to the Korea's successful cultural policy in the context of UNESCO's Convention of Cultural Diversity. Well, South Korea currently enforces a screen quota system that requires cinemas to screen local movies for at least 73 days out of a year. But in fact, there has been a decade-long question that do we still need it? Do we still need the screen quota? Well, many people argue that the screen quota in South Korea has no meaning at present because the market share of the domestic films in the local film industry has been steadily about 50% for the past 20 years. And the local films have, well, they insist that the local films, the Korean films have already acquired competitiveness in the Korean market. And of course, again, it's an issue of free market and the core of quote the core of capitalism. But however, other industry people, I mean, including myself, well, think that we need this protective measure in order to protect cultural diversity, and to keep the local film industry to secure a sustainable growth. But in practice, the local and international, the digital platforms, all kinds of digital platforms, as well as the local movie theaters, do not really recognize these protective measures, the quota system. And meeting the legal requirements is not a concern for theaters or TV, the broadcasting channels, simply because the local contents are highly preferred and successful in the markets. So the irony is that the success of Korean films in domestic and international markets led the idea of abolishing the existing protective measures. So this is a very simple, I just put a very simple keyword here. But like many other countries, the digital platforms have changed and transformed the distribution and consumption of the Korean contents, both in domestic market, both in domestic and international market. Well, in the domestic market, the competitive dynamic has been amplified concerning the streaming services, especially on SVOD, as Professor Lobato mentioned earlier in this discussion. We also have a very strong presence a strong growth. We also see a very strong growth and remarkable presence on streaming giants such as Netflix or Disney Plus. And these streaming services enhanced accessibility and discoverability of international audience for Korean content. While the recent global hit, the Korean dramas such as Squid Game and Hellbound are both Netflix original series. And Solo's Inferno, I'm not sure if any of you might have heard of. It's a Netflix dating series, became the first Korean reality show to make it onto the streaming platform's top 5 and enters top 10 of Netflix most watched TV program. Well, so far I have talked about the positive, the positive aspects of the Netflix investment on the local Korean content. So far, the Netflix seems to be providing a new production opportunities to Korean artists and content, particularly to filmmakers entering to TV production. Certainly, it is a positive aspect of the streaming services to connect Korean content to international audiences behind International Film Festival. I think that this is what the creative people are fascinated about, because because in the past years the Korean films have been introduced and circulated mainly through international film festivals. Of course, we had our international distribution has been progressing, but mostly it's still the International Film Festival has been one of the main channels too. But I would like to point out, but will this happy scenario go in the future? Currently, there is no protection measure for local content on both domestic and global platforms. The protection measures only lies to the theaters, the physical movie theaters, and the broadcast TVs. Well, the Korean government put a lot of effort to support the creation and production of new content. The support mainly includes the skill set program for young and inexperienced industry professionals, while production and distribution funds for independent art films, but it mainly focuses on the infrastructure. So it means the Korean government do not have any kinds of direct support for these the contents like Squid Games. In order to enhance the Korean contents are easily accessible online, the government institutions developed some sort of online friendly program. So, for example, the Korean Film Archive runs a YouTube channel providing a numbers of more than 100 classic films from the 1930s for free viewing. The Korean Film Council also launched a new program showcasing Korean cinemas and content, audiovisual contents with the English international English cable channel. And the funding mechanism to support local films entirely relied on the Korean Film Council Fund, which levies a 3% of all ticket sales of domestic film theaters. But it means that the foreign contents also make financial contribution to run the Korean Film Development Funds. But these does not apply to any streaming services or online platforms this does not apply to any digital platforms. So lastly, talking about the legislative issues regarding to protect and promote the diversity of local contents online, there is a legislative reform undergoing to modernize the Broadcasting Act and adapt it to the digital environment. It is to renew the Broadcasting Act and the decree of the promotion of the Motion Pictures and Video Products Act to set new rules and regulation to invest of Korean revenue in local content. I believe that this sounds very familiar to most of you. So for this reason, the South Korea has been carefully seeing and monitoring the legislation process of European Union and France. So it is important to raise the voices about the issue to ensure the local contents being sustainable online in terms of, in terms of distribution online. Well, for the time being, the relevant proposal was made into National Assembly last year, but the challenges arise from various reasons. It's conflicts of law is one. I think it is one of the main reason, and the second, in the practice, the success of local contents holds back the needs of new protection measures on online platforms. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any questions and comments are welcomed.
Thank you so much. Thank you for getting up early for us. So we'll now go to, we have a few minutes left for questions. So again, there are two ways you can do questions. You can put them in the Q&A, the traditional one, or if you want, you can raise your hand. So I'm just going to take a look here and if any of you raise your hands, that should show up on my screen. And sorry, just going through here, everybody. So far, nobody has raised their hand, but if there are any, or you can put a question in the Q&A. And while we're just seeing if there's any questions out there amongst the participants, I was interested from our Australian colleagues in hearing a little bit more about the politics of I think Matt especially was talking about the politics of the situation, because that definitely is going to be a concern for us in Canada, where there's going to be an attempt to reintroduce legislation that would bring the streaming platforms kind of into our so-called walled garden, as we like to call it. And politics are definitely at issue there. And I think the real difference with Australia is that there's this huge affection in Australia for Australian content. And there's definitely affection for Canadian content in Canada too. Quebecers especially are very, very fond of their content. But I think it's a harder sell in Canada because we're so much closer to the States. So I wondered if Matt and Ramon, either of you had thoughts a bit about the politics of it and selling it politically. I was very interested that conservative politicians might be more receptive to that kind of nationalist, I guess, for want of a better word, argument.
Yeah. Do you want me to go first? Okay. So I found this, I've been in this job for about 10 years, and I've found the drumbeats behind the politics of our industry and culture very interesting and complex. There is a sort of a jobs and growth mantra for economic sort of positioning from both sides and all sides of politics at times. It's ironic we sort of subsidise international productions a lot, but that it's ironic that a more conservative government sometimes does that. But you realise that this is about big business overlaying their interests into the lobbying process. And what we have done successfully is wound back some of the more negative approaches that our governments wanted to take for our sector in for various reasons. It's included attempts to deregulate our cable and television, cable and satellite services. There are requirements for local drama expenditure on those services. And there's been attempts to, in increasing incentives, drop some over in the corner that would have affected smaller operators, smaller businesses, maybe more niche documentaries and other things. It was kind of positioned as a trade-off for getting greater incentives, and we fought those back. The basis by which we fought those areas was through kind of alliances between, on the one side, sort of progressive politics such as Greens movements that are very about ensuring we have a creative story, and the most sort of more conservative elements of our conservative politics, which is actually a coalition between the Liberal Party, it's called Liberal, but not meaning that in probably the traditional sense, it's called the Liberal Party, and the National Party, which is a country and regional and rural Australian party, and they've formed the Conservatives government. Now it's the National Party who are very, very keen to ensure that their representation of Australia and their stories of regional stories of Australia are able to be reflected on screens both across the nation but also internationally. They feel incredibly passionate about ensuring that the Australian story is told, because that is we had that need in our regional storylines, and they have been a great ally and interesting bedfellows effectively to prevent maybe a more economic rationalist approach to our screen sector from occurring. And the one other thing I'd say is that Indigenous culture has, we've invested in Indigenous culture through various mechanisms for a long time. We've had a national broadcaster, which is purely about Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island culture. And we've had funding through various mechanisms to establish for 25 years or so an Indigenous screen sector. There is a great embedding and passion actually for Indigenous stories that are coming through in all sides of politics. So that is almost, and I don't want to trivialise it, but it is a bit of a weapon in our discussion here, because Indigenous culture is obviously the bedrock of Australian storytelling deeply. We talked about it, we acknowledge country. And if you were, as a government, to damage Indigenous culture, it's very, very difficult politically. There is a strong, strong story around this, which I think is where we, in a political sense, need to also continue to be forthright. And I don't know if Ramon, you want to add to that? Sorry, Kate.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that's very interesting, obviously, because from a Canadian point of view, we're in a similar place, and Indigenous stories are increasingly important to us. And I think this is a very strong point to be made, that there are groups other than the mainstream culture who aren't heard in a Netflix dominated world. And I think that was also Michelle's point about Maori culture, that gives gives New Zealand a real power in their quiver. Sorry, yes. Ramon, I interrupted you. Do you have?
Oh no, I agree with all of Matt's points there, and I mean, I think there's a kind of heady mix in the current political debate of, you know, local kind of lip service to local content, but in different ways and for different purposes. Economic protectionism, which is really driving a lot of the discussion. And, you know, kind of populist policy making, which often takes the form of kind of Facebook bashing, Netflix bashing, that kind of thing. And there's many valid reasons why policy needs to be very strong on those companies. But I think in the political climate in Australia, that has been perverted and distorted really. And the result is not always good, kind of good policy making, good policy thinking. Yeah, so I mean, for example, we have a kind of, oh, sorry, Matt, go on.
No, I was going to say that's gone as far as a intervention in, which is pretty world leading in insisting that Facebook and Google and others pay traditional media proprietors a levy effectively for using news services. Now that, of course, again, but it also reflects that is a driving policy advocacy exercise by traditional media, News Corp and others. So it shows you where the government's bent is. And before I forget to mention, I think that it's fascinating. I always think, what is our, in the nicest possible way, what are our enemies saying? We know that for example, that the Motion Picture Association, which represents studios and Netflix and others, are very active about trying to say that the market can operate without intervention. They use Korea in the domestic sector as a tool to say, oh, well, you look at how powerful the Korean industry is without intervention. And of course, they fail to talk about, as our colleague did so well, all the interventions that have built the film sector that then everything springs off. They refer to the UK market as a wonderful example of how it all works, but they fail to mention terms of trade and other mechanisms that have built the UK market.
Maybe
and
we can turn to, because we just have, I think, time for one more question, and we do actually have a question for Yoon about the situation in South Korea. So someone was asking exactly that, about what are the specific financing mechanisms that have been so successful in South Korea. I know you spoke about the quota and argued the quota is still needed, but are there financing mechanisms as well?
Well, yes. Well, let me just briefly talk about the funding mechanisms of film sector. Film sector. So the funding mechanism, the government funding, the government funding entirely relies on the Korean Film Council Fund, which basically levies 3% of all the ticket sales in a local movie theater. So the South Korean government runs the national box office. I think this is maybe the only national box office having 100% of local cinemas data on the real time. So this is the base of based on this data collection, the government charges the 3% of the film ticket sales, so including the foreign cinema. So this fund is used for support. I mean, support for the local films. I mean, in the all process.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have to close up here, wrap up, but thank you all so much. Thank you for getting up early in the Asia Pacific region and speaking with us. This has been really informative. Ramon, Matt, Michelle, Yoon, thank you so much. Now we'll move on to our final session with Peter and Nathalie. If Peter and Nathalie, you're ready to go, are you? Yeah. So I'm just, sorry, there's Peter, I see Peter. Okay, I will introduce Peter and Nathalie then. Peter Grant is a Toronto communications lawyer. He is adjunct professor at the Schulich School of Business at York University in Toronto. And Nathalie Guay, of course, is executive director of the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. And I think their conversation is going to wrap us up for the day.
Well, that's great. And Nathalie and I have agreed that I'll start with a few comments and then she will conclude. I want to first of all thank all the speakers and panelists today for a very enlightening discussion. We ended up hearing panels on the situation in Canada, Europe, of course, Latin America and Africa, and finally the Asia Pacific discussion that we just heard. And Veronique gave us a useful review of how trade laws could adversely affect measures on cultural diversity. So that was also very useful. What I found interesting in the discussion all through the day was there were a number of very common themes. I mean, the first and probably the most important was the realization that the over-the-top streaming services on the internet are having a major impact on the traditional media. They're reducing the audiences for conventional broadcasting. And those are the that are usually regulated to support local cultural diversity. And what's happening is a lot of the audiences are migrating, particularly the younger audiences, first and foremost, to the over-the-top streaming services. And public service broadcasting is also losing audience across the board in most countries to the streaming services. And we look to public service broadcasting as being a big support for cultural diversity. So that was the first thing that I thought was very held in common with everybody. The second, I saw a couple of people noting the concern about algorithms. And here we have the problem that they're essentially unregulated, but we now know that these algorithms give rise to some real problems because they drive people to content that may support the advertising, but isn't interested in diversity or public service. So a number of people focused on that. And then we find, of course, around the world, everybody now reflecting on these concerns are now addressing them, and a rising move to regulate the over-the-top services to support diversity. And it's not just local expression or national expression, as we might say it in some countries that represent diversity. There was also a real reflection that we wanted minority language expression. For example, we heard that the Catalan language in Spain, for an example. And there's also a real support for what we often refer to as BIPOC expression, Black, Indigenous, people of color. The Indigenous community needs to be reflected. And we heard that loud and clear in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So when we put it all together, what is happening out there? And I guess I should have mentioned one other factor that showed up interestingly, particularly in Australia, Canada, and France, and that was the need to support independent producers. And by that, I mean giving them the right to maintain their copyright so that they have the residual rights and library rights. They don't have to give it all up to the streamers. So those were the themes that I heard over and over again today, and I found it very interesting. Because as Kate Taylor noted earlier this afternoon, we're all having to face these problems. It's not just one country, it's all the countries. And so I just want to conclude by thanking everybody for their contribution. I think it was a marvelous opportunity for us to hear these differing points of view. And I also want to add my thanks to the people from the Pacific region who probably got up at 4:30 in the morning, their time, in order to hear some of this. And so thank you so much for contributing. Thank you. Over to you.
Merci, merci Peter.
Thank you, Peter. If I may, I'll go directly since today is coming to an end and everyone can be very tired. So thank you, Peter, for your very relevant comments. I want to also thank all of the panelists, the interpreters, the moderators for their excellent participation and contribution to this event. I would also like to perhaps make a few comments from a point of view, well, maybe from the point of view of civil society. Well, maybe a first observation. The guidelines for the implementation of the Convention for the Protection and the Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions were adopted in 2017. It's now 5 years ago. And what we've observed today is that apart from Europe, we haven't yet managed to actually implement the substance of this agreement, in the national laws, even though it's moving forward in various regions of the world, but it hasn't yet been implemented to protect in the new digital world. So this directive already 5 years later, they have to make updates to it. The offer of online cultural content is being done very quickly. Things are changing very quickly, and issues like showcasing discoverability of cultural expressions, algorithms, these issues are more and more at the forefront of the government priorities, as well as civil society organizations who ask these updates of the law to be made to continue and protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions. And this delay in certain countries, well, we've seen how it could be explained in different ways. We've seen that the political processes are long, there are priorities that are in competition that could slow down the adoption of legislation to protect cultural expression and diversity and the new streaming services. Also, certain trade agreements could sometimes lead to complications and all this, and even the success of a national industry, it sometimes could slow down protection measures in the case of the importance of adopting and modifying the laws for the new digital environment. So I would say actually that throughout all of this, what we also see is that the civil society is very much involved, and it also must be involved to constantly remind to the politicians and the colleagues and also in the public space and the media up to what point these legal reforms are necessary to continue to ensure the protection and the promotion of the diversity of cultural expression in the digital world. We've seen the transition is being done unequally throughout the world. It's being done at the rhythm of the great disparity of access to technology. We've had eloquent examples of this today, even amongst ourselves, but it's being done quickly, and there's a risk of not having success if we don't hurry up. And throughout all of this, maybe Canada will be a kind of second school in the adoption of these reforms throughout the world, because Canada will include the sector of music, which was not included in other reforms, in many other reforms. It's not usually discussed in the projects that we've observed in other countries, whether Australia or Latin America, and that Canada might be at the leading edge also for discoverability. And maybe Canada will bring certain regulations on this issue, which everybody agrees it's an important aspect, discoverability and showcasing of the content, and it's an emergency to act on this front. Well, maybe it will not become the first example of Canada, but still Canada will be an interesting example on the deepening of what it means to have a diversity of cultural expressions nationally for the diversity of expressions, but also the native or their expressions, the expression of women and communities that are subject to racism. Well, anyway, it's the first conference, and I'm assuming we will want to have more in the future, because I believe in a collective capacity to accelerate the train. And I think that in the coming years, we will see far more legislation, and we'll have to once again meet and talk about this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathalie, for that summary, and Peter for yours. Wonderful bilingual summary there of everything we've talked about today, and it's really been an inspiring, well, for me, afternoon, for I hope everybody else the whole day. Thank you so much to our many varied panelists from around the world, showing us that we are not alone in these battles. And thank you, of course, to our interpreters, who permitted us to have a three-way or a trilingual conversation, which is a big job of them, sort of not silently, but invisibly getting translation done. So thanks so much to everyone, and thanks to Nathalie for organizing. And